All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Freedom, it's something we often take for granted until it's gone.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's where today's topic comes in. We're going deep on the writ of habeas corpus.
Ooh, habeas corpus, exciting stuff.
It is, and we've got some incredible research lined up, stuff tracing this idea all the way from ancient roots to today's global scene.
Wow.
Yes, specifically, we're looking at how it works or sometimes doesn't when you throw international borders into the mix.
Oh, that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. Our mission today is to make sure you really grasp why this great writ, as it's often called, is so crucial to your personal freedom. And don't worry, we're going to do this without getting lost in a bunch of legal jargon.
Yeah, no legalese here. We'll keep it clear.
So let's break it down. What exactly are we talking about when we say habeas corpus? I mean, it sounds pretty fancy, right?
It does sound a bit intimidating, but it's actually pretty simple.
Yeah?
Habeas corpus, it's Latin,
Okay.
and it translates to you should have the body.
All right. So what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it's a fundamental safeguard or protection against being unlawfully detained. So think of it as a legal mechanism that allows you to challenge your detention.
So like if someone is locked up.
Exactly. It forces the authorities, whoever is holding the person, to bring them before a court and justify why they're being held.
So it's like the court saying, hey, show us this person and give us a valid legal reason for keeping them behind bars.
Exactly. And here's a crucial point. It's not about guilt or innocence.
Really?
It's strictly about whether the detention itself is legal.
Oh, interesting.
And another important thing to remember is that anyone can file a habeas corpus petition on behalf of the detained person.
So it doesn't have to be the person themselves who's locked up.
Not at all. It could be a family member, a friend, or even a concerned citizen.
That's actually really powerful. So this idea of protecting against unlawful imprisonment, it's not a new thing, right? Our research suggests this concept goes way back, even before the Magna Carta.
Oh, absolutely.
Which, for our listeners who might not remember, that was signed in 1215.
1215, a big year.
So we're talking about 12th century England. And what's really fascinating is initially, this wasn't just about individual rights.
Right.
It also served as a tool for the king, right?
Exactly. It helped ensure people showed up for court when they were supposed to.
Oh, so it kind of maintained order in the kingdom?
In a way, yes. It was part of the king's judicial process.
That's super interesting. So it wasn't just about protecting the little guy. It was also about maintaining the power structure.
Precisely. And what I find really fascinating is that this fundamental desire to avoid unlawful imprisonment, this human impulse, it seems to have popped up in various legal systems throughout history across different cultures. The Romans had something similar called de homine libero exhibendo.
Oh, well.
And the Spanish had manifestation. These are all echoes of the same core principle.
So it's not just an English thing. It seems like this is something that's been important to people for centuries.
It really highlights that habeas corpus isn't just a legal technicality.
Yeah.
It speaks to a deep-seated human desire for liberty, for freedom from arbitrary detention.
That's really powerful. And of course, when we talk about these historical roots, we can't forget the Magna Carta, right? Especially Clause 39, which basically states that no free person should be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of their peers or by the law of the land.
Yeah, the Magna Carta was a major milestone. It laid down the groundwork for so much of what we consider fundamental rights today.
Absolutely. And as our research shows, this principle continued to evolve, leading to the development of specific English legal tools. Ultimately, it became a core constitutional right in England.
A long journey for sure.
So let's fast forward a bit. We come across some really pivotal moments in the history of habeas corpus. The first clear recorded use of habeas corpus ad subjudiendum, which, and tell me if I'm pronouncing that correctly, dates back to 1305.
Wow, that's going way back.
Right, during the reign of Edward I. Now, for our listeners, think of ad subjudiendum as the most important form of habeas corpus. It's the one that directly compels the person holding someone in custody to justify that detention in court.
Yeah, it's the heart of the matter.
Then we have the Habeas Corpus Acts in England, first in 1640, and then a really significant one in 1679.
Yeah, 1679 was a game changer.
It sounds like a huge step forward.
It was. That act really solidified the rules to prevent unlawful imprisonment and put an end to this practice of sending people overseas to basically dodge legal scrutiny back home.
Oh, wow. So they were trying to circumvent the law by sending people away.
Exactly. It was a way to silence dissent or get rid of troublesome individuals. The 1679 Act put a stop to that.
So it established stricter procedures.
It did. It set specific deadlines for authorities to respond to habeas corpus petitions and establish penalties for noncompliance.
There were actual consequences for ignoring this writ.
Absolutely. It was a major turning point for individual freedom in England.
And this idea, of course, made its way across the Atlantic.
To America.
The U.S. Constitution specifically mentions habeas corpus and sets limits on when it can be suspended.
Right. Only in cases of rebellion or invasion.
That's a pretty high bar. Then we have the Judiciary Act of 1789.
Okay.
This empowered federal courts to grant habeas relief to people imprisoned by the federal government.
So if you were held by federal authorities, you could petition a federal court for your release.
And then after the Civil War in 1867, another act extended this protection to state prisoners if their federal rights were being violated.
So even if you were held by a state, you could still seek federal intervention if your federal rights were at stake.
It sounds like the scope of habeas corpus has evolved quite a bit over time, especially with decisions made by the Warren Court.
Oh yeah, the Warren Court was very active in expanding the reach of habeas corpus.
And then, of course, we have the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, passed in 1996.
Right, ADPA, that was a bit of a shift in the other direction.
It seems like it narrowed the scope of federal habeas corpus review.
It did, in an effort to streamline the process and prevent what some saw as abuses of the system.
And we can't forget the landmark case of Boumediene v. Bush in 2008.
Right, that was a big one.
Which dealt with the detention of individuals at Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah, a really complex case that grappled with the application of habeas corpus in the context of the War on Terror.
So this idea, this protection against unlawful imprisonment, it also traveled to the Philippines.
It did during the American colonial period.
It was introduced in 1902, and believe it or not, was actually suspended for a short period in 1905.
Oh, wow.
But since 1935, it's been a guaranteed right in their constitutions.
So it's enshrined in their fundamental law.
Exactly. And they even have specific rules outlined in their legal system, something called Rule 102 of the Revised Rules of Court, which governs how habeas corpus petitions are filed and processed.
So they have a clear legal framework for handling these cases.
They do. And our research highlights some really important Philippine Supreme Court cases that demonstrate how their legal system has navigated this, particularly during periods of unrest or political turmoil.
Right, because that's when these protections are really put to the test.
Absolutely. Now, it's worth noting that habeas corpus has been suspended a few times in Philippine history.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the most recent being in 2009.
Interesting.
But what's fascinating is that the 1987 Philippine Constitution established much stricter rules for suspending habeas corpus.
So they learned from their past experiences.
It seems like it. Now, a suspension requires a report to Congress, and it can only be done in very specific circumstances.
Like during a rebellion or invasion.
Right, and it can only be applied to offenses related to that rebellion or invasion. Plus, there's a strict 3-day rule.
What do you mean by 3-day rule?
A person has to be charged with a crime within 3 days of their detention, or they have to be released.
Wow, that's a pretty tight window.
It is. So it's clear that the Philippines takes this right very seriously. But here's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
What happens when we start talking about situations that cross international borders?
Yeah, that's where it gets complicated.
It does. See, in international law, there's a fundamental principle of state sovereignty. Basically, each country has the authority to govern within its own territory.
So a country's laws generally stop at its borders.
That's the basic idea. And even within the Philippine legal framework, their rules seem to limit the application of habeas corpus to within the Philippines.
So if someone is detained outside the Philippines?
It becomes a real legal gray area. And we saw this play out recently in the legal challenges surrounding Rodrigo Duterte's potential detention in The Hague.
Right, the former Philippine president.
The Department of Justice in the Philippines argued that their courts lacked jurisdiction because he was outside the country.
So they couldn't issue a writ of habeas corpus for someone detained abroad.
That was their position. However, the counter-argument was that since he was traveling on a Philippine aircraft, that aircraft was like an extension of Philippine territory.
Ooh, so they were trying to establish a legal connection.
Right, but that's a really tough argument to make in international law.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a stretch.
And from what we've gathered, there's no specific legal precedent in the Philippines for using habeas corpus to demand the release of someone held solely by a foreign authority in another country.
So it's uncharted legal territory.
It is. Now, international law does have provisions against arbitrary detention,
Okay.
and it recognizes the right of individuals to challenge the legality of their detention.
But usually that's within the legal system of the country where they're being held.
Exactly, or through international human rights mechanisms. And here's another important concept, the principle of complementarity in international criminal law.
Complementarity, that sounds interesting.
It is. Basically, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, only steps in when national courts are unable or unwilling to prosecute certain crimes.
So it's a court of last resort.
In a way, yes. It's designed to complement national legal systems, not replace them.
Makes sense.
So you have this tension between a country's desire to protect its citizens abroad and the need to respect the sovereignty of other nations and the authority of international courts.
It's a delicate balance.
It really is. Now, it's important to remember that habeas corpus, while powerful, isn't a magic solution.
Yeah, it has its limitations.
It's not a substitute for a regular appeal process. You can't just keep filing the same petition repeatedly. And it primarily addresses the legality of the detention process itself, not necessarily the fairness of the underlying law.
So it focuses on procedural rights.
Primarily, yes. And of course, as we've discussed, there are those exceptional circumstances where it can be suspended.
Right, during times of rebellion or invasion.
Exactly. The Duterte ICC case really exemplifies these complex scenarios.
Yeah, it throws a spotlight on those tricky gray areas.
It does. I mean, think about it. What if a foreign government unlawfully detains one of your citizens? Or what if it's an international tribunal?
Those are tough situations.
They are. In those cases, the Philippine government's main options are things like providing consular assistance, engaging in diplomatic efforts, trying to negotiate a release.
So they have to rely on diplomacy and international pressure.
A lot of the time, yes. Actually, trying to enforce a Philippine habeas corpus order in another country is extremely difficult, almost impossible.
Why is that?
Well, because they lacked direct legal authority outside their own territory, and there's this principle of non-interference in the affairs of other countries.
So they can't just barge in and demand someone's release?
Unfortunately not. Ultimately, they often have to rely on the legal system where the detention is happening or pursue remedies through international mechanisms. The Duterte case really highlights this complex interplay between national sovereignty, international obligations, and domestic legal remedies.
It's a fascinating case study for sure.
So for our listeners, the key takeaway here is that habeas corpus is an absolutely vital safeguard against unlawful detention. And it has this incredibly rich and fascinating history.
Yeah, it's a cornerstone of individual liberty.
But when we start talking about applying it across international borders, things get really, really messy. It's not a simple process to use your own country's laws to demand someone's release from another country.
Right, it's a whole different ballgame.
And this brings up a really important question for everyone listening to ponder. In our increasingly interconnected world, how can fundamental legal protections like habeas corpus evolve to effectively safeguard individual liberty beyond national boundaries?
Yeah, how do we protect people's freedom in a globalized world?
Especially while respecting the sovereignty of different nations and the authority of international legal bodies?
Right, it's about finding that balance.
Exactly. Will the future of these protections depend on stronger international agreements? More robust enforcement mechanisms? These are questions worth thinking about.
Absolutely, food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.